Okay, and we should be now recording. Okay, so we're gonna get started with this. So a quick little about us. So hi, my name is Noah Williams, and I'm a co-organizer for the Bedford High School Alumni for Black Lives, alongside Hunter Marshall House, who you will meet soon in the next few minutes. And so we are both graduates of the Bedford High School class of 2017, and the Bedford High School Alumni for Black Lives is fully committed to both Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. We advocate for a school system and city that centers the most marginalized among us, and in doing so, uplifts the community as a whole. And additionally, if you are a Bedford High School alumni and you would like to join us, we'll make sure to drop our membership form from the chat. We welcome anyone from any year to join us. And so, yeah, by the end of the Zoom call, we'll make sure to drop the membership form in case you'd like to get involved in any way, shape, or form. And we appreciate anyone's involvement. So let's go over the logistics of how this is going to go. So like I said earlier, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted onto our various social media websites. The structure of this event will be a discussion that Hunter and I will be leading with our featured guests about school resource officers. And then there'll be a Q&A session where we will invite you all to ask any questions that you may have. And now Hunter's going to go over our 3 different themes for the event.
Hi everyone, I'm Hunter, as Noah introduced. I just wanted to begin by thanking everyone here for joining us today as we discuss the topic at hand, which I think is essential to have right now here in New Bedford. Our discussion will follow 3 main themes that you see here on the screen, which includes first, understanding the role of SROs, then we'll move on to their direct and indirect impacts on our student bodies and our community at large, and finally acknowledging the need for legitimate resources here in the New Bedford Public Schools and what those should look like. Joining us in our discussion today are Mr. Nagayoshi and Ms. Chaplain Burke. Chaplain Carolyn Burke has a distinct relationship with New Bedford and the surrounding communities. A former teacher in Wareham, Chaplain Burke has continued to serve our youth through her current roles as a pastor and a marriage and family therapist. As a current New Bedford High School student, as a parent of a current New Bedford High School student, she finds that advocating on behalf of our youth is essential for promoting positive and effective changes to ensure the prosperity of our community and their futures. Mr. Takeru T.K. Nagayoshi is the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year. He teaches English at New Bedford High School and centers equity in his teaching and teacher leadership. A senior Commonwealth Teach Plus Fellow, TK has followed a policy focused on policy around diversifying our schools and supporting leadership roles and opportunities for teachers of color. He has written op-eds on culturally responsive work, helps recruit educators of color through the Massachusetts Department of Education, and serves on several state committees, task force, and advisory boards to fight for equitable and anti-racist policy recommendations. Nationally recognized educator, TK also leads trainings and workshops around the country and has received several awards on behalf of his work. Again, I want to thank our 2 guests for joining us this afternoon for what I hope will be an insightful discussion. So I guess we can go ahead and get started. And I wanted to first ask the both of you, our guests here today, what do you think the role of SROs is here in New Bedford?
I suppose I will start. I apologize. I am trying to switch over to my computer so I don't have to sit and hold the phone, but this is what we have going for right now. SROs are called school resource officers, and I feel that's a very appropriate name because I don't feel that they are student resource officers. They are school district resource officers that are involved in schools in a punitive way. They are their law enforcement officers. They are not teachers. They are not social workers. They are not guidance counselors. They are law enforcement officers. And their role plays a punitive part and an intimidating part for many students.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very insightful in what you just said. And I want to identify that school police partnerships emerged in the 1950s as a method to control for the urban shift happening across the nation as we experienced youthful rebellion, social changes through civil rights activism. So this SRO branding that they rebranded when we started to see school shootings happening and grow originated in this ideological shift that we were seeing in the nation for them to control this. I don't know if you have anything to say on that, Mr. Nagayoshi.
Yeah, first and foremost, I just wanted to thank both you and Noah for creating this space for us. I'm a huge believer in just having student voice be at the center of conversations like this, and to just have my former students, New Bedford alum, leading this conversation makes me really happy. I also want to acknowledge that I'm not an expert on this at all. I am still learning. I'm still trying to figure out a lot about this debate, and what I say and how I'm processing with you all together in this community discussion is not supposed to represent, what the school thinks, what the district thinks, what DESE thinks. I also want to acknowledge that, even as a person of color, but someone who's not dark skinned, I'm not affected in the same way that I think Black and brown communities and students of color in our school are as it relates to the conversation of SROs. And so I wanted to name that, right? And really my intention here is to just kind of learn, to listen, to be a part of this conversation. And I think that's a good segue to the next section, because I haven't known too much about the Triad system and the different ways in which school resources officers are in theory supposed to be made. And so, my understanding of a school resource officer was just like a law enforcement person in our school systems, but apparently they have an educator and mentorship aspect as well, right? And so I thought that was kind of interesting, and I wonder to what degree that is something that is actually operationalized in our school systems.
Yes, and thank you for bringing up that triad model. So for anyone that may not know what that is, so there's the National Association of School Resource Officers, and they developed this triad model that they have developed for SROs. And the triad model refers to educator, informal counselor / mentor, and law enforcement. And so, like, while they they only require a minimum of 40 hours of training to fulfill all of those very encompassing, very encompassing different roles. So I would just like to know, Mrs. Nagayoshi, and as well as Chaplain Burke, what is just your response to that idea of being able to fulfill those three roles? And both of you have both been educators, and but in your current work, Ms. Nagayoshi, what is your idea of that triad model as a current educator?
Yeah, it was such a new concept to me, right? Especially around the claims that school resource officers are invested in education and mentorship of our students. It sounds really nice, but my gut feeling is that those aspects aren't always operationalized in most of our schools, meaning that, at least to my knowledge, our education system doesn't necessarily create the space, the resources, the training, the support for our school resource officers to actually realize that vision of the triad, especially the education and mentorship component. And so, when I was looking through that slide, there's pictures of it and everything. I was wondering in even New Bedford Public Schools, how is and does the education mentorship component look like? As educators and mentors, how are these resource officers trained? Do they focus on restorative models, de-escalation strategies, SEL, trauma-informed care? And so I had questions around, I think, the theoretical underpinnings of that education mentorship model. And if there is that kind of implementation of that model, is it made so that it's an equitable distribution among all those three roles? How do we ensure, right, that there isn't this undue emphasis on the law enforcement function when it comes to the school resource officers? And so if I had to guess, right, I would say instead of it being this perfect triad, right, this perfect distribution of those three different roles, it probably in practice looks more like a very narrow isosceles triangle, like a scaling triangle, where perhaps the main function of SROs is law enforcement, not education or mentorship. And it's what most of us, I think, picture when we hear a school resource officer, a gun-toting, uniform-clad officer. And for communities that have a fraught relationship with law enforcement, I think it can be challenging, right, for an officer to effectively serve as an educator or mentorship type.
Yes, thank you for that. And Chaplain Burke, just to bring your perspective in on this triad model as well. So you are a marriage and family therapist. And so what is your response to this idea that they're able to deal with and be what's called informal counselor / mentor? So what is your perspective on that idea?
My perspective is that the idea is ludicrous. When I was a teacher, I had to have my bachelor's degree. I had to take state examinations to become certified. And then within 5 years, you were expected to get your master's degree. To become a counselor, I had to get my master's degree. I had to have over 800 hours of client services, learning how to do paperwork, learning how to deal with insurances, to be properly trained. The idea that 40 hours is supposed to train them to serve in this triad manner while also carrying weapons, standing behind a badge, is ludicrous to me. Also, these children need to understand that they have no expectation of privacy, that there is no HIPAA protection for anything that they might say to these police officers in the hallways of this school. It might indeed get them listed on a gang database and give the police permission to come to their houses to check on things from something that they've said. They also are allowed to lie in their interrogations or when they're speaking to people. That in no way can invoke a trust or a mentorship relationship.
Yes, thank you for all of that. Yes, most definitely. And so, but however, there are a lot of people that tend to be in favor of SRO programs, and they often see them as being beneficial because of this idea that they are able to establish positive relationships with students, which also help police departments form better relationships within their communities. So then my question is, should police officers use the school environment, a place where young individuals go to learn for about 7 hours a day, as a place to build community relations? And either of you can feel free to tackle that question, that idea that even with all the harmful impact that they may have, they're building a good relationship with the community. So how do we think about that in the context of everything that we just said about their inability to even do this triad model of work?
I feel like it goes back to whether those programs are established, they're funded in a way that actually allows for that positive relationship building to happen. And also, if it is, right, the ratio or the degree to which this happened needs to overwhelmingly focus on the positive aspect, not the law enforcement aspect. And so even in education, right, in teaching, we talk about this idea of positive reinforcement and positive engagement. For every critique that I give to a child on their essay, I should be looking for 2 more positive things, 2 more positive comments to say. People tend to remember the negative aspects, right, and to emphasize the negative things. And so, the question is whether a sworn law enforcement officer whose most visible and recognized function in a school is using force or the threat of a force for safety and crime prevention, can a figure like this, right, be seen as a positive role model, as a mentor, as an educator in a community that is historically distrustful of law enforcement? And I had a student a couple years ago who lived in the south end of New Bedford. He dropped out his junior year, but he'd often tell me a lot of stories about his neighbors making violent threats to him and his family. And he laughed in my face when I suggested that he get the police involved. He told me that the police doesn't care about what happens in the ghettos, that there's things in his home life, that he didn't feel comfortable with law enforcement being involved in. And sometimes when police are involved, they make for him the situation worse. I had another student last year who graduated, who when she was in the 8th grade, her first encounter with a police officer was being suspected of being disrespectful, and they banged her on the police car, right? And she was, again, only 14 years old. And it hadn't dawned on me until I've had these conversations that, a lot of us have very different perceptions and lived experiences with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And even talking about that my first two students, I had a very different experience, growing up in an upper middle class suburban neighborhood in Secaucus, New Jersey, than from the south end of New Bedford, for instance. And so I think from that perspective, I'm not sure if I'd come to see a figure who represents all of those things to ever be a mentor or an educator in our schools, especially, if I have that baggage, if I have that lived experience, and if I know that these folks also have the authority to arrest me.
Yes, thank you for that. Just to see, Chaplain Burke, do you have any comments you would like to add as well?
I do. I'm just, forgive me, just give me a second.
Oh, they're good. Take all your time.
Yes, I think after school programs are great to enhance community relationships, but when you're inside those walls for those 7 hours, there's enough going on that you kind of need to just be focusing on your educational goals. And you're not in an environment of a prison, or at least you're not supposed to be. Okay, there are very normal behaviors that these children experience, and there are some who have either personality things going on, ADHD, or some kind of other DSM diagnosis that is not criminal. Children need to learn how to resolve conflict between themselves, and they need real mentors who are there to help them, not to penalize them or in any way intimidate them, threaten them, or increase their punishment. That doesn't teach them how to learn to resolve conflict. It is bad enough that there's an Ash Street jail strategically located where some of the poorest residents live. Okay, and it's bad enough that they have to see a high profile initiative to watch them. Now they can't even go to school, the one place where they might have be somewhat free from the regular pressures that are in their life without seeing someone carrying a gun, wearing a uniform that is there to tell them, behave or else. Something is definitely wrong with you that you need to be punished for. I cannot speak for all of the children in the New Bedford school system. I have 3 children that have passed through that school system that said they felt no benefit of an SRO being there, that it wasn't helpful, that they weren't building relationships with them, that they didn't see them outside of the school and in the community, but they knew that they were police officers. They knew that they weren't mentors. They knew that they weren't teachers. They knew that they weren't guidance counselors. And the clients that I do work with feel very intimidated, like they're being watched, like they have extra patrol going on, because even when they go to school, they can't escape. Okay, it's very unfortunate that there have been school shootings. I went to an all white. I was the first and only person of color to attend some of the schools that I attended growing up. We didn't have SROs. I was in fights all the time to protect myself. There was the first week, a police officer did escort me to school to make sure that, there weren't any problems. I had to learn karate. I learned how to fight, and I was constantly in fights. A week later, the Ku Klux Klan moved into our neighborhood. The police came to the school to keep them out of the school, but they didn't come into the school. They didn't get involved with what was going on internally. And when we were in fights, they told us we had to learn to live with each other. When there were behavioral issues, the teachers and the counselors sat down with us to work on them, and that school ended up having an excellent reputation, ended up becoming very diversified over the next 10 years because the community worked together to not make the situation punitive, to not make it, to escalate racism, but to educate and understand each other, and to open a great dialogue and communication so that we could better understand each other and learn to live with our differences. So it was very beneficial to use other resources in another model that wasn't punitive, but that was increasing understanding of each other.
Yes, thank you for those comments. I think they're great. And I think that goes back to one of our main problems that we're having right now is that the New Bedford Public Schools Committee hosted a forum on October 14th, acknowledging the purpose of SROs in our district schools specifically. And they push this narrative that they're solely there for building these relationships. And so that garners these questions on, if they're here to build relationships, why do they need to have weapons on them? Why are they arresting students in the schools for disruptive behavior? And that sort of discussion leads me into my next question that I had, is how would you define the school to prison pipeline, and what role do you think SROs play in it? And acknowledging, when I speak about the school to prison pipeline, I'm acknowledging what the ACLU, or the American Civil Liberties Union, has acknowledged as what they describe as a disturbing national trend wherein children are funneled out of the public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Many of these children have learning disabilities or histories of poverty, abuse, and neglect, many of which Chaplain Burke, you already acknowledged, and would benefit from additional educational and counseling services. However, instead, they are isolated, punished, and pushed out. So I guess getting back to the question is, do you think SROs play a role in this school to prison pipeline that we see happening across the nation?
If I could take this one, I definitely feel like it's part of this broader conversation, this broader systemic issue that we have, and how Black and brown students of color, low-income students of color, are oftentimes treated within a broader school system, right? To the specific point about SROs contributing to the school and prison pipeline, I do think it adds to a normalization of the best way, right, to deal with behavioral issues, to deal with infractions that happen in our school, is not to try to understand the source and root of it, which oftentimes are more systemic issues related to poverty, trauma, but to look at it as a punitive issue that needs to be corrected with, threat, right? But going back again to my systemic point that I was trying to make, what was I trying to make? I do think in many ways our school system by and large fails to understand and to feel and to recognize the humanity of our children of color. And I think one of the things that I've always been thinking about as an educator of color is the disproportionate the misalignment amongst educators in our school systems who are disproportionately white, right, and our growing number of students who are people of color, right? So even in the state of Massachusetts, only 8% of educators identify as people of color, whereas 40% an increasing number of students identify as people of color. And when there is that mismatch between those who are a part of a system and those who are being served, right, and stand to benefit from their system, I think it has a lot of implications on how we end up seeing and how we end up treating and how we end up supporting these students. There's a lot of research on how students of color are less likely to be seen as innocent, right, by their teachers, that they're really given the benefit of the doubt. How certain things like wearing a certain type of clothing or having the wrong type of hair can oftentimes lead to infractions. I think Noah Hunter, you mentioned how there is a disproportionate way in which students of color, specifically Black boys, for instance, are diagnosed or put on these individualized plans or seen as behavioral issues. And so I think for me, I also see it as like a systemic issues related to race and how our system tends to fail people who don't belong in the majority culture.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, there's a lot of underlying assumptions that inform these concepts about the school to prison pipeline and also policing in schools and policing in schools generally. And there's this idea as well that goes beyond the school prison pipeline and also looks at what's called like the school prison nexus. So let me be clear here, it's not the school to prison nexus, it's school hyphen nexus. And that's a significant distinction to make because the concept takes into account the ways in which the system of education itself does not just funnel students into what Black feminist scholar, I highly recommend her work. Her name is Beth Ritchie, an icon. Anyone interested in any type of justice issues or things like that, look into her work. So Beth Ritchie has this idea called the prison nation. And so basically it's this idea of the prison nation in connection to the school prison nexus. It conceptualizes education as being part of that prison nation. So not necessarily just funneling students into prisons, but necessarily the idea of police culture being a part of the school system and education itself. And I guess my question for both of you, and either of you feel free to take this, is do either of you think that there's a problem not only of just police in schools, but a larger problem of policing in schools as well? And that can happen in many different ways, whether that's through just policies of how you're expected to deal with like a student who's misbehaving in class, or like a student who's like tardy a lot of times, or things like that. So like, just to rephrase the question again, do either of you feel like there's this larger culture that needs to be combated beyond just removing police officers within the school day and even after schools as well?
I do, and I apologize before. I was having some connection issues when we were talking about the pipeline. I think it's that SROs are just a part of a great systemic system, including low-income housing that is by design set to trap people into not being able to do better for themselves, and to not being able to be two-parent families to raise their children, to not being able to teach them about their own culture without having to teach them to watch out for themselves and to act in a way outside of their manner or culture for fear of something happening to them just for the way that they look. And if you look at the privatization of prisons, especially prisons for youth, and the money that's being funneled, and the money that's being spent to have SROs in the school districts, and the money that's being spent for the sheriff's office and putting up signs everywhere and being able to run all over the country, there's a lot of money going into corrections and to punitive damages, instead of a lot of money going into mental health services, into education, into being able to actually teach children and encourage them and give them hope. They're being shown that there's prisons right where they live. They're being shown that there's punitive officers carrying guns when they go to school. They're in a high patrol initiative when they go home. It's a very, very large system of punitive damages. And it's horrendous, and it's frightening, and it's traumatizing for children who've already experienced violence, who have already experienced trauma, who have to be concerned about safety for their race, who have to be concerned about safety for the community that they live in, who have to be concerned about safety for the violence that's going on around them, who are trying to make choices to stay safe, but to also stay legal, to also stay out of trouble, to also make their families proud. It's a vicious cycle, and there's a lot of money being funneled into just penalizing them instead of actually trying to lift in and give them a hand up. If the SRO program was done what they say it was designed to do, they would be in there giving those kids a hand up. They would be in there helping those kids. Malcolm Gracia was one of those kids. The SRO program certainly did not help him.
Yes, thank you. I think you're hit the nail on the head right there. And I think that goes to the point of um, having SROs in schools. They kind of add this additional surveillancing factor onto our students that are from these marginalized communities within New Bedford. And as Mr. Nagayoshi was talking about, the disproportionate representation of administrators or teachers who are of color and can represent the larger growing student population that is also minority students. So according to the recently published article by the NAACP, Taylor, these are the schools throughout New Bedford. So Taylor, Swift, Rodman, Pacheco, and Cogden have 100% white student teaching bodies. Teachers at Lincoln, Winslow, Campbell, DeVals have 95% white student teaching bodies. So Pulaski, Kearney, Whaling City, Normandan, Jacobs, Ashland, Keith Middle School are all more than 90% white teachers. So Chaplain Burke, do you think this dynamic enhances the teacher policing on minority students? And if so, how?
I absolutely feel it enhances it. I mean, by design, it's very difficult for us to understand or accept things that are different than we are. Unconsciously, I think even people who have accents that we tend to think they're kind of stupid. And I'm not saying they are, please do not misunderstand me. But I think unconsciously sometimes we think, oh gosh, they can't even speak English properly. But they can speak it above and beyond what their first language was, and they're coming into and assimilating into your culture and learning things about you that makes them pretty amazing and intelligent to me. However, we tend to think that if it's different, that it's not quite where we are, and we either out of lack of knowledge, out of fear, out of lack of desire to learn about something different than we are, we tend to just shy away from it. And in other cases where we have some authority, we tend to be more punitive towards it as well. And that unfortunately just kind of happens in human nature. And it's something that we all have to look inside of ourselves to try to overcome. And you have to coordinate and you have to get out of your comfort zone and speak to other people and immerse yourself in other cultures. I didn't grow up with anyone who looked like me, but I certainly learned in the curriculum that we needed to be contained because we were savage, because we were godless, because we couldn't think for ourselves. I mean, we weren't even allowed to use our own language and sing our own hymnals and worship our own gods because we were somehow inferior. And those are the things that I learned in school. And I had no one to go, well, I did. I had amazing parents, thank God. But in general, in my community, with my educators and everything, I had no one to go to for help. I ended up with one in all my years. Their amazing teacher who taught me more about African American history and all the different things that we had invented. And she put me in touch with other people who looked like me so I could have good role models and examples. It's essential to the development of self to have role models that you can identify with. And when that doesn't happen, you can sometimes feel a lot less than. You need people who look like you, who are very well educated. And one of the things that the superintendent says is that it's difficult to recruit. As far as I know, there are still a lot of HBCUs in this country, and there are still people taking education classes. When I taught in Wareham, there were several other teachers of color, and they were amazing. And we were able to band together, but we also were able to work with the other teachers in that school system, and we didn't feel like they were looking down on us, or they thought less of us. They actually would ask some interesting questions. Literally, one of them asked me why we like watermelon and banged up Cadillacs. I kid you not. But they did have a desire to learn, to understand the culture a little bit more. And we were able to stop making such sweeping generalizations and interesting statements like that. But there was a desire and an interest and a willingness to learn. When you are lacking that, the relationship just becomes more degrading. So it's essential to have a more diverse community. We do not have 100% Caucasian students. We should not have upwards of 96 to 100% Caucasian staff, because they simply will not know how to reach the students, and they have no one on their peer level to reach out for the help if it's homogenous.
If I can also add to what Chaplain Burke was saying about the importance of people of color within our school systems. Certainly about like the role model effect, right? We know the research that's out there that says educators of color have a good impact, not on just the climate and culture of the school, but also increasing academic achievement, decreasing dropout rates, not just for students of color, but for all students, right? But they're also the ones who are most likely to advocate for anti-racist policy, to push back against anti-racist protocol and practices that exist in our schools. I remember hearing from one of my Black educator friends who worked at a charter school, where one of the rules that they had was you cannot wear headbands, right? And then at first glance, it might not sound like a problematic issue, but what he as a Black man noticed was that it disproportionately impacted his Black girls who wore headbands, not because they wanted to flex some kind of fashion statement, right? But because they wanted to hide their edges. And so it's a good example of how who but an educator of color, who but a school leader of color, specifically one who shares a similar community background, can or will advocate for their students through a lens that centers race and does it in a way that's unapologetic. And it's not that white people, white educators can't or don't do this. They certainly do. But I think they are on average less willing or able to do so. And as a light-skinned Asian man, I also include myself in this analysis. And it's not because we're bad people, right? But I do think our light-skinned privilege in many ways are an existential blind spot. And so that's the power of having people of color, educators of color in the classroom, in our school systems. And the reality is that we don't have that.
Yes, I think both of you touched on so many important things. And one thing that I think is important to know, so there's this famous essay by French Fanon, it's the idea of like the fact of blackness. It goes back to like the underlying assumptions that like inform the ways that we think about specifically Black people, but also different types of people of color, and how there is that assumption in which we need to be consistently just policed in all different types of contexts. And I think that's just so important to know, especially because when we talk about diversity, it's about also engaging with diversity and things like that. So like it's more than just, oh wow, we have all these different diverse staff and things like that. It's about recognizing what Ms. Nagayoshi just pointed out. It's about recognizing those ideas and like those things that harm people on the daily just because of like it's a policy. People think, oh, it's okay, it's a colorblind policy. And there's this culture of being colorblind, but like it's really not. Every single thing that we do, everything that we say, every budget that the school committee makes is a moral document. There is no such thing as being colorblind. Politics is deeply embedded within everything. And while we're talking about the school dynamic and this culture of policing, so Chaplain Beck, you had touched on this a little bit, but I was just wondering if you would be able to say a little bit more on how you feel like the psychological effects as someone who is a marriage family therapist who deals with children in the schools within that context, consistently and professionally. How do you feel the like psychological effects of that constant culture of policing affects someone and their ability to even see themselves as a student who's to even do their homework that night? So if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit on that.
I can speak directly. I've gotten permission from some of my parents this week to use some direct quotes from some of the children, and I've written some of them down. And it said, I asked to speak to my guidance counselor. I knew that I was having an episode and I was getting very anxious, and I asked to leave the class. I started to shake and I was told to sit down. I said, I asked very nicely about being able to go and speak to my guidance counselor, and I want to leave the class because I need some time to calm down. Again, I was told to go sit back in my seat. And I said, please, can I just go see my guidance counselor? I'm having a bad moment. It's going to spin out, and I don't want to be here in front of all my classmates when it does. I get teased enough, I get bullied enough, and I want to leave. And the school resource officer was called on me, and someone came in with a gun and put their hands on my shoulders and dragged me out of my classroom. I am 13 years old. I wet my pants. I was terrified. I'm terrified to go back. I feel so ashamed, like I'm so bad that the police officer has to come and take me out of my own school. I've been suspended for a week when that happened, and I just feel bad all the time. But you have helped me, Mrs. Burke, to realize I'm not a bad kid, that I have issues and I need some help, and that you said I'm very brave to be willing to work on them. But it's very hard to work on them knowing that someone is in my school with a gun, especially after watching active shooter videos. I'm more afraid of the person who's in here saying they're protecting us with the gun than I will ever be of one of the other students coming after me. That's the effect that this has. Why is someone who is asking for help being punished? Why wasn't a guidance counselor called? Why wasn't a school adjustment counselor called? I'm not even going to read I have two more, but I'm sorry, I cannot. That was hard enough to get through one, and that was just one example of the fear that my clients feel. And thank God they're comfortable enough being able to speak to me about it. But when you've already experienced trauma, when you've already experienced violence, school is the only place some of these kids can go to get away from that. School is the only place some of these kids actually have a balanced meal, where they're not arguing with their siblings, where they're not dealing with domestic violence, but they have to go be faced by someone with a gun who can drag them out of class. It's unacceptable, and we have to do better. Is it about our children, or is it about the adults in the administration who don't want to deal with children who might have some kind of a DSM diagnosis or disorder, or who might actually just be behaving in ways that children behave. Children fight, children disagree, children have some behaviors that are really cute and really quirky and really cool and sometimes really naughty, but they're not criminals. And they shouldn't have to go to school and feel like they're in jail. It's hard enough to learn, especially when you do have a learning disability, a physical disability, and you're already dealing with potentially with peer bullying, with peer pressure, and you don't know what happens in these kids' lives. When I taught one of my kids, and I'm talking an 11th grade kid, thought that I went home and talked to my whole family about chemistry all day long. And that was my life because they didn't know me. And if I don't know their circumstances, but they're a child and they're entrusted to my care, I'm going to try to find out what's going on with them. I'm going to try to help them, not criminalize them, not traumatize them further. And I spoke to my own 3 children and asked them if they had any benefit from having an SRO in the school, if they ever saw them in the community, if they ever built a relationship with them, since that supposedly is one of the goals, to improve the relationship with the community. And God knows they need to, but school is not the place for that. And also my children said, no, we knew they were police officers. I probably already mentioned that, but I'm just reiterating that they're not serving a purpose of engaging with these children, lifting these children up, mentoring these children, or keeping them safe. School resource officers have helped in maybe 1%, if that much, might be being generous, of actual school shootings, which actually happen phenomenally more than 73% of the time in suburban and rural areas. I had a gentleman speak to me the other day. I was taking pictures of chalk from a protest saying, oh, well, what about all these kids bringing guns and knives to school? I said, well, are there reports of them bringing guns and knives to school? I would like to see the reports of the SROs that are going to the superintendent, that are going to the police department. And I'm very curious about what type of information there is. They talk consistently, all these people in charge of the city and the chief, about transparency. If people are bringing guns and knives to school and there's all this threat of violence, where is it being reported? Who's been arrested with a weapon in the school? Who's put in a threat to shoot someone inside the school? Prove it to me. Where's all of this data that our schools are so dangerous?
Thank you, Chaplain Burke, for sharing that really unfortunate accounting that's happening here in New Bedford. And that's just one of many that I would assume that go silent. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I guess that would shift us into alternative resources that we want to see implemented in New Bedford Public Schools that we think would benefit our students specifically more than SROs have and can do. So given both of your experiences working with students, what resources do you think students of New Bedford need?
Okay, I'll start. I was going to kind of, well, I'm curious to hear what the teacher who's currently teaching has to say about that, but since he's, thank you, allowing me to go first. Obviously, I think that they need more guidance counselors, and I'm not trying to get myself a job in saying that. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I work outside of the school. I don't, just work with children. I work with whole family systems, which I wouldn't be able to do there. So I'm not advocating for myself. I'm advocating for children. They need more counselors, and not just a counselor who's going to direct them in a career path. A counselor that understands what challenges they're facing in their own academic journey, a counselor that understands what they're facing when they leave school to go home for the day, and who understands how to de-escalate a situation. They need more books. The entire 7 years that I taught, I was never able to send books home with students because all of my classes had to share the books. No, there are so many other resources that are needed in the school system, but education is always cut in favor of other things, but yet there's money to send SROs into school. And if you want to improve the relationship, the onus as I said it before, I'll say it again, the onus belongs on the police department to figure it out, not the school department. So definitely more diverse teachers to be able to work together, more diverse administrators, and maybe even some like kind of inter-county board or something that works together instead of just looking at each other's models. Talk about it, get together, try to figure something out that's going to actually help these kids. Because the entire time I was in school, the entire time I'm sending my own children to school, I have seen some wonderful, amazing, dedicated teachers who are working really, really hard. I want to see everyone putting the children first, not telling them that they're bad, not telling them that they don't have a future, that they can't do it, not be willing to actually help them. But it's also very difficult when you're staring at 35 faces, half of them are on an IEP or a 504, and you don't have any help in your classroom to individualize anything and to give them the time that they need. So more classrooms, more teachers, more aides. There's lots of different ways that those resources could be put to better use than having a person walk the halls and police it with weapons.
I also feel like what I hear in Chaplain Burke's response is that oftentimes when we look at a student who's misbehaving or some kind of infraction in class, we fail to understand what the underlying causes are. And so having guidance counselors, people who can understand really the broader reasons behind that kind of misbehavior and really at a community and systemic level, what sort of begets that kind of trauma and lack of investment, for instance, in education are things that I think we as a school system can kind of look into. As far as like specific resources are concerned, I think a greater investment and a tiered intervention protocol that helps teachers, educators identify consequences that are proportionate to the offense that's committed. And so, for instance, like if or without a tiered intervention, a teacher might call the office for an SRO officer to remove a kid just because she flipped them off or something. And I've seen that happen in my own high school, where my foreign language teacher, her first response always for any reaction or infraction in the class was to call the office and get the student removed. And I think a more tiered approach, something that really looks at like what Chaplain Burke was saying was if a kid, for instance, is acting out of class, then I might take them out for a conference to check in with them. I might take the time to kind of identify what's going on. I might use restorative practices to let them know of the impact that they've had, to remind them of the implications, right? If this issue persists, then I might reach out to the guidance counselor, to crisis support. I might call home to figure out some kind of intervention plan, some way that we can support the student in a socio-emotional way. I would then track if those changes and those discussions have led to any kind of change. And if those situations don't work, then I want to get and seek other additional help from the administrators. And I think, by and large, New Bedford Public Schools have been doing a good job in emphasizing those approaches. I think in recent years, we've also become more literate in trauma-informed approaches and cares to understanding our students so that we can contextualize how poverty, adverse childhood experiences oftentimes manifest as antisocial disruptive behavior. I remember trainings and PDs, professional developments on de-escalation techniques so that, when something does go off the rails, we're doing our best to minimize that impact, right? Instead of adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. And more recently, and I think to the earlier conversations that we were having, anti-racist and culturally responsive pedagogical approaches so that we as teachers, for instance, in the classroom can start identifying our own implicit bias and the way that we treat and teach our students are perhaps the reasons why they're acting out in the first place, right? But lastly, I want to say like spaces like this and spaces that are specifically led by students. And I'm such a huge proponent of making sure that when it comes to addressing issues within our communities, we have to come together as a community and co-construct our understanding of what the problem is, not in spite of them, right? And so I'm really appreciative again in that regard that Noah and Hunter and everyone in the New Bedford High School alumni for Black Lives Matter has done such a great job in identifying a problem and pushing forth these conversations and filling in that void, you know, as it relates to conversations like this.
Thank you both for going into that and outlining specific types of things and cultural as well as specific type of just programs and resources that we need within the school system. And we're about to transfer over into our Q&A session. I do want to leave with this one quote. And so for context, this is a quote from a current school psychologist within NBPS, and they submitted this as a public comment to the school committee. And so this was for their, I believe it was their July school committee meeting. So I'm just gonna read what they had wrote. And then we're gonna go over to our Q&A session just to outline just how much of a dire need there is for resources. And the people that are able to do the work are not able to do the work because of the structure of the school system within NBPS, and because of, while they're starting to understand maybe and things like that, the actual funding and things like that need to be put in there. Like I said earlier, like these budgets and things like that are more documents that reflect the things that you value and things like that, and the people, and if you value your students. So with all that in mind, I'm going to read what they had said. So they said, I strongly urge this committee to consider adding additional school psychologist positions in the nearest future if possible in order to better serve our students and community. We are drastically underutilized with regard to the skills and training we have. And our current climate requires we be all hands on deck with regard to the social and emotional needs of our students. This is a role that the school psychologist was designed to fill, but we are not currently able to do so due to the number of positions we are allotted. So just thinking about how it's important that we think about the way in which these types of problems are designed in a way that they necessarily impact students in a way that necessarily harms them. And so we need to actively combat that, not only that mindset, but the policies and the way that we think about things and structure things, and to combat those types of programs and implement them so that eventually at some point we can truly be an anti-racist school district where Black lives do certainly matter, as well as all other marginalized lives within the school district. And so before we transfer into our Q&A session, I would just like to, if there's anything else that you, Mr. Nagayoshi, or Chaplain Burke would like to say that you haven't said before we transfer over, feel free if there's any important things you would like to add before we go into the Q&A session.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to share, like, you know, from a teacher standpoint, why looking to or finding some sense of safety or comfort in an SRO is perhaps not the best way to manage your class, right? And I think when teachers look to school staff authority to control their classroom, what's actually happening is that we're really legitimizing, right, our own authority in the classroom. We're sending the implicit message to our kids that we ourselves are not capable of handling the issues or problems that take place in the classroom. And so, for instance, going back to my foreign language teacher that I talked about when I was in high school, right? Every time she did that, she was saying to us, right, to me as a student, that this is the type of teacher who has no way of dealing with or building relationships with her students. But I think more fundamentally, it's an issue because it's abdicating the responsibility of the teacher to own up to the things that they are doing wrong, that's causing, that's inciting, that's facilitating that misbehavior in the first place. I had an AP student a couple of years ago. He was a feisty gay kid who loved to argue, very smart, very opinionated, right? And he was suspended from school because he had an argument with one of his teachers. I don't know if an SRO was involved, but the incident was taken outside of the classroom clearly, and an authority figure was brought in to sort of manage the situation. And so when the student came back after his suspension, and I asked him, well, why did you argue with that teacher? What happened? He told me that it's because he thought that his teacher was being homophobic towards him. She made this wince when he commented on how he thought this athlete was hot, and how that moment was a small moment in this long list of invalidations to his own contributions, how this teacher had made him not feel smart, in the way that I know that he is. And so he's had this built up resentment towards these microaggressions. And on that particular day, he decided to go off. And I don't condone, right, him going off, but I raise that anecdote to illustrate how when teachers defer to these external sources of authority, right, for their class management or whatever, right, they're also deferring their own responsibility to own up to the mistakes that they have made and to grow themselves as teachers. And I think as a teacher, when we look to external sources of authority, right, rather than investigating and interrogating our own practices in the classroom, where I think that's where it starts, it's really hard to heal that relationship with our kids when we cross that threshold.
Thank you for that and sharing that story. Chaplain Burke, do you have any final comments before we switch over into the next part of this?
No, I agree 98% with what he just said, except that I don't think that it does start with the teacher. I think it starts with the parent. And when I was a child, if I got in trouble at school, I didn't, but okay, no, I won't use that example. Around me, when people got in trouble at school, they got in trouble at home. And there was a collaboration with the parents and the teachers. And I understand there's a lot of single parent homes, and I understand that there's a lot of people who work 2 jobs, but you have to know what's going on with your child. You have to be in communication with the teacher. You have to come up with a plan. And if the 2 or 3 of you can form that type of collaboration, the child is going to be better off. You might not necessarily feel the need to go outside of your own classroom. And the teacher is the authority, and they're in their classroom, and they need to be able to run it the way that they see fit. And I know, having been on the student side, it reminds me of the parents. Like, one might say, okay, whatever you want, whatever you think, but wait till your father gets home. And to me, that's kind of in the child, the child mind, that's the equivalent. I'm going to get the SRO on you if you don't behave. I don't have to be responsible for my own classroom. I can call somebody else. No, it lies within the classroom, the teacher's domain. And a parent is a very good resource to reach out to for help with the student in the classroom before an SRO becomes involved, which then goes to the superintendent, which then goes to the police station, which may end up with police involvement in your entire family. It's one of the very worst places to go. And again, I would just like to reiterate that there is no expectation of privacy with any communication that you have or a child has with an SRO. And I'm concerned about the close working relationship that the superintendent and the police chief have, and what information is being exchanged between them about our students. Especially as a parent of a New Bedford High School student, I would encourage my daughter to never even say hello at this point to an SRO. Don't get on their radar at all. Not that they couldn't come here, there isn't anything here, but I don't want anything that she says, because she should have the freedom to speak her mind, her feelings, her truths, to create an issue with someone who doesn't provide her with confidentiality. The doctor's office provides it. The counselor's office provides it. They don't provide it. I certainly hope the school provides it for them. And I'd also like to just say thank you to you and Hunter for allowing me to be a part of this discussion tonight.
Thank you. Yes. So I know we all definitely have a bunch of different questions and things, and also perspectives, especially on this last idea of what role the parents should play in terms of this aspect of things like that. So, and I see there's a few comments in the chat as well. Some people have already expressed some views and things like that. So we are going to open it up for questions and things like that now. So feel free to use the chat to drop your questions, or you can also use the raise your hand function on Zoom, and Hunter or I will call on you. And yes, so feel free to just raise your hand or ask a specific question through the chat function, and we'll do that for about 15 to 20 minutes and see where we go from there.
I think Mr. John Oliveira has a question, if you want to ask.
Yeah, Hunter, thank you very much. And I wish I had known about this venue before. I only found out a few minutes ago. And I'm glad you all are talking about it. And obviously I have some very different opinions and being on the school committee. But, you know, my children, I'm the only school committee member with members with children in the school district. And one of my kids has had a very positive relationship with an SRO. And I'm not saying your kids have to go find them, but the SROs play an important role. It's not necessary, but when we talk about teachers having kids dragged out, that doesn't sound like it's an SRO problem. It sounds like it's a teacher issue, and that we need to educate our teachers that the SROs aren't there to manage their classrooms. But we also need to work on getting more involved with parents. I have 2 kids in New Bedford High School, and I have yet to hear from one teacher in 4 years on one of them to even just say, hey, your daughter's doing great. That's a problem. It's not the SRO. The problem is we aren't communicating with our families, and we aren't holding the parents and the students responsible for their behavior. I do not want the state raising my kids. I will do that on my own. That's all I have to say. But thank you very much. I appreciate that you all having an opportunity to discuss this. And I hope to see you at some of the school committee meetings we can discuss this more. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry, feel free. I was going to ask if anyone has either of you had a response. Feel free.
I do have a response, but I'd be curious if anyone else has one. So I'll shut up. I've been talking.
Hi, I actually have a response if nobody else wants to go first.
Feel free.
First and foremost, if you hear a tiny voice in the background, I apologize. My toddler is a silly goose. So I actually just recently finished an academic paper surrounding SRO programs. And I'm going to have to politely disagree with John as both somebody who's in their final year of undergrad to become a New Bedford Public School educator, somebody who is a parent myself, somebody who previously worked as an ABA therapist in Kearney, and a former New Bedford resident. From all of the research that shows, and I think that's great that you had a wonderful positive experience with SROs, but unfortunately, survivor bias is not data. There is so much solid research that discusses like the horrible things of SROs. And we're not even talking about those dramatic instances of 6-year-olds getting arrested for normal, typical behaviors and tantrums. We're talking about just like the sheer fear that some children feel who have negative encounters with police officers outside of school. You know, schools should be a safe space. It is where they come to learn. There were a lot of children in New Bedford who are food insecure, who live in poverty, who come from homes with trauma, drug abuse, neglect, et cetera, et cetera. It is not fair to demand that they go into their safe space and live in fear. And when we talk about how it's a teacher's fault, the teacher is not going to reach out to every single parent daily and say, hey, your kid's doing great, because they have a plethora of other things they have to get done at the same time. And their concern when they're reaching out to you is typically not a positive experience, it's typically negative because they have to reach out. Something else has to be taken into consideration is it's not a child's fault if their parent isn't present. And it's not fair that we demand that these children get punished for a parent's failure. You know, I remember being very frustrated watching so many parents not even come to their own child's IEP meetings. You know, I'm obviously a very involved parent, and partially because I'm on that other side as an educator. But when a parent's not stepping up, you don't default to traumatizing the child. You know, you have to look into what resources could we be implementing? Are they not being present parents because they have to work 2 jobs? What financial assistance programs could we be using instead of spending the astronomical amount on SROs? The SRO budget right now for New Bedford Public Schools from the district alone is over $280,000 annually. That's just from the school district. The other half is matched by the police department. That's absolutely ridiculous that we have to go with classrooms with torn books. We don't have enough after school programs, but we revoked half of the drug intervention programs that we had. But we have all of this funding for law enforcement officials. And I have yet to see anything that's actually positive come out of them. All I see is negative experiences, them funneling children into the school to prison pipeline, traumatizing children. There's not preventing school shootings like they're supposed to be. they're criminalizing children. You know, you shouldn't be catching kids doing drugs at school. That's not what you're there for. If you're concerned about a child doing drugs, you need to get a counselor involved so that they can get them into a rehab program or they can talk about it to somebody. You shouldn't just be going around arresting them. So I'm going to have to politely disagree that I don't think that there's any benefit to SROs, and I'm sorry, but the research stands behind what, you know, all of what you guys said.
Yes, thank you for voicing that. And I think that us as an organization should also be transparent here. We are fully against school resource officers, 100%. Absolutely. We think of them as being harm by design, intentionally harmful for all the reasons that you had pointed out. And yeah, so we definitely do enjoy though this discussion that we are having here because sadly, you know, discourse matters, and you see, we tend to not question our most basic assumptions when it comes to public safety. We tend to think of policing as consistently being the most beneficial method of responding to anything, and that's just quite frankly not how it is. And for so many reasons, it tends to harm the most marginalized among us. And yes, I have nothing else to say regarding that. But if anyone else has a question, also thank both of you for your persistence on that. Anyone else has a question regarding our panelists or would like to raise up some other issue or concern that they think that we haven't talked about enough, that they think is also part of this conversation that should be discussed, feel free. And again, you can either raise your hand through the raise hand section of Zoom, or you can drop something down in the chat. I see a lot of things in the chat that I'm most definitely missing. So if you see something that sticks out to you, feel free. Mr. Nagayoshi, see your hand is raised.
I love that. A former student calling on me.
I thought the same thing.
If anyone else wants to talk, I'm also happy to. It's unfortunate that Mr. Oliveira is not here because I wanted to agree with what Alexia had said and co-sign on everything that she was talking about. I'm really wary about solutions that kind of deflect the issue to something that happens at the parent or family level, right? And then like how Alexia and Ms. De Silva was talking about, not every family member, not every parent is financially or economically positioned, right, to be there for their child and to advocate for them in ways that I think more privileged families are from. I am that teacher who calls the homes and tries to say something good about the students to 120 plus kids that I have, but I also have parents who tell me, please don't call me because I'm at work and I have to stay at work until 2 o'clock in the morning, and you telling me that my son didn't finish his essay is quite frankly not my priority. I also have parents that numbers don't work. I have parents for whom they don't speak English. I have students who don't even live with their parents. And so this idea that if we can just get our parents or family members to just do their part and educate their children to do the disciplining, then things will be good is not, in my view, a legitimate way of addressing the issue, a realistic way that's addressing the issue. And I also feel like it's a way that's addressing the issue that comes from a unique privileged perspective. And I'm glad that he and his children have a wonderful relationship with SRO officers. I want to acknowledge that. A lot of SRO officers as people are amazing individuals, right? But wouldn't it be more amazing if we can have those amazing individuals not have guns, be in schools, and can be guidance counselors, if they can actually be teachers, if they actually can be mentors, right? And so, yeah, if those positive relationships are what you are looking at as the reasons for why these folks should exist, there are other ways in which we can facilitate and invest in those positive relationship building aspects to make sure that they happen for our students. And I think lastly, what wasn't mentioned, but I think is implied in folks who support SRO officers that I wanted to acknowledge is this security aspect. What will happen, for instance, if we do have an incident or someone comes into our school with a gun? And we also have a lot of empirical evidence that, you know, officers might run away if the person who comes into our school comes with an assault rifle. How can a handgun realistically also counter that as well? And so I think the better question might be like, to those who support these measures, is this really the solution to those perceived threats, right? Is this, if the benefits that you promote that don't have anything to do with safety are really something you hold true, are there other ways that we can invest, right, in that? And if not, you know, I think it's worthy to ask ourselves, is it just an expensive security theater?
Yes, I agree with you too. It was my policy when I did teach that for every 3 homes I had to call because there was missing homework or because there was an issue, I would call 2 to say they're doing great. They got this grade on this exam and this is how this went. And then they were really perplexed as to why I was calling them if there wasn't a problem. And, you know, some people are literally faced with being fired if they stay home with a sick child and they don't have time to help with homework. They don't have time to go to meetings. But that doesn't mean that on the other end, we're not supposed to do our part, to do everything that we can to help the child. But I do also feel that, you know, parents can be a great resource if we are communicating with them. You know, I can't remember a day off when I taught. So whatever time was available that they could talk, I was available to talk. So, you know, we do need to work with whoever we have to work with. And I can only speak for myself, but when I taught, and even everything that I do now, is to try to benefit and help and not to harm or penalize children who don't behave perfectly. Because as far as I know, Jesus was the only person to walk the earth that was perfect anyway. So we have to deal with imperfections. We have to deal with behavioral issues. And it's really the wrong profession to get into if you think that that's criminal behavior or that it deserves to be criminalized. There are career days, there are career fairs, there are community events, all types of things that give police officers opportunities to improve their relationships with people in the communities. School is not a jail. It's not supposed to have the hallways policed with armed individuals.
I'm going to open up the space again in case anyone has any questions. Again, thank you, Chaplain Burke, for that. I just want to say this in addition to that. When we talk about, you know, criminality and things like that, it's important to realize the ways in which some people are inherently criminalized as a result of just simply existing and things like that. And I just wanted to make that point and make sure that we are keeping that in the back of our minds as well as we think about school resource officers and this culture of police and policing and things like that. And if anyone has, we have some more time for a few more questions or anything like that, or anything someone wants to raise that they feel like needs to be part of this discussion, feel free. Again, feel free to use the chat, or honestly, at this point, you don't even have to raise your hand. You can just speak if you would like. Yeah, so again, the space is open. Oh, we have Cynthia Roy, feel free.
Hi, but I did see that Keegan was raising his hand before me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Keegan, sorry. This is why I am not a teacher. Y'all don't know how to do this on Zoom. I can't. Keegan, feel free.
Oh, thank you. I'll try quick. I would first thanks to Mr. Nagayoshi and Ms. Burke. This has been really informative, and I really appreciate your perspectives. I have a question on what your thoughts are on New Bedford exceptionalism. There's been that sentiment, and we've seen that kind of all summer. Not too long ago, there was even an article in New Bedford Guide about why are New Bedford police being punished after what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd. And so we had, which is, well, never mind. I'll get to that. But what do you about what we should do here in New Bedford? Because a lot of people like to be so confident in the fact that we're a very diverse city. But if you went to New Bedford High School or Keith, it was diverse, but it wasn't necessarily embraced all of the time. You know, sometimes from a personal anecdote, Greenhouse, I think the second floor was called Guatemala, and all of these things, and that's just commonplace in New Bedford, and it's not really embraced. Earlier this summer, there was a student council meeting with Superintendent Anderson, the mayor, and other school committee members, and they said, well, we'll talk about it. We haven't really heard much from them. So do you have any comment on the situation specifically here in New Bedford?
I know that one of my clients called New Bedford High School segregated diversity. That basically the houses were divided into colonies, is how he describes it. So when you're looking at numbers from the outside looking in, you say, oh, great, these are our populations of students. But now we've got them all kind of clustered together. And then when you looked at I know you haven't looked at it here, but the discipline data, it's largely people of color. It's largely people with disabilities. It's largely people from poor communities. And they're congregated together. So the diversity piece kind of doesn't really include the diverse individuals that are a part of it. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were getting at, but it might look diverse on the outside, but it's not inclusive and it's very segregated.
I completely agree based on my experience. I also went to Keith Middle School, and I think that situation is probably the worst situation with the SROs I've seen. Often they'd have SROs being brought into classrooms if kids were acting up. I remember at one point there was a fire drill, and I guess a student pulled the fire alarm, and so we were all escorted outside, obviously. And the student who had pulled the fire alarm, they were handcuffed. And as we were walking out of the building, we saw the student sitting down, surrounded by police officers, handcuffed. And I had talked to people when I went to college that went to mostly white schools, and they said, no, people pulled fire alarms at our school too, but they didn't decide to bring in police and handcuff them and scared straight tactics. So yeah, I think similarly.
Well, I had mentioned I grew up in a neighborhood where I was the only person of color. And I can tell you that fire alarms were pulled all the time. And I grew up in an agricultural area, so stink bombs were set off in the labs and all kinds of, typical childhood misbehavior. And while there were some in-school suspensions for this behavior, we didn't have SROs. The police were never called. It was never criminalized. And they did, they used the in-school suspension so we could see, oh, they're in trouble, don't do that, as that was the means of setting the example. There was some punitive to it because, they don't want you to keep doing that because the fire department has to come, they have to pay for that, but it wasn't criminalized. And certainly no one came with handcuffs and they weren't arrested. Like I said, they weren't even out of school suspensions. They were in school suspensions. So granted, I'm a little bit old, so that experience was a while ago, but that was my experience in that rural neighborhood. Very, very, very few behaviors were criminalized. I literally had someone cut off half the skin on my face. I was out for 3 weeks with grafts and everything else. That was the only time anything was criminalized because that was an assault, and still it was a child, so they weren't actually arrested or have to go to jail, but the police did come and speak to them, and they ended up having to do some community service. Their parents had to pay for my medical expenses and everything, but I mean, it was just downright violent, but we were still kids and we were figuring our way in our relationship and everything else, and they continued to work with us to try to improve it. I mean, and there was a lot going on in that little town in Mid-Atlantic region, but we weren't criminalized. They did everything they could to try to make that neighborhood work that I was in. And at the time I felt like, she should be in jail after doing something, like that. But I can see the benefit now of having us come back together, of having, it being an expense for her parents. And I cannot say that we ever became friends, but she certainly learned how to live with people of color around her and to keep her hands and her mouth to herself. She had to learn how to coexist. And had she been criminalized as a child, she may have, and she may not have, but she may have grown more bitter, and it may have caused more problems than it solved.
Thank you for saying that, and thank you for your question, Keegan. I just want to give you as well, Ms. Nagayoshi, to if you would like to talk about the idea that Keegan had brought up of like the Bedford exceptionalism, especially as someone who works within the school district, and if you think that's something that you have seen within like teachers, administration staff, or just the general culture within the district, that idea that racism and all these other problems that we are talking about is not a problem here because New Bedford is this great multicultural society that's just perfect. Wow, I totally framed that question, but whoops. But anyway, Mr. Nagiosi, feel free if you would like to respond to that idea.
I certainly agree that the fact that we're diverse, the fact that we're a low-income urban community can give the false sense for educators and school leaders that therefore we're inclusive, therefore we're equitable, therefore everything is peachy keen and there's nothing wrong going. And clearly from this discussion and from the stories and anecdotes that we've heard from today, that's not the case. I want to be careful here because I think there are so many incredible people in the New Bedford Public Schools who are doing it right. And sometimes it's the system, right, that kind of overwhelms us. And sometimes as a teacher, I myself feel like I am a gatekeeper to practices that I am not comfortable with. But because of the nature of the job or just what it means to be a teacher, to grade and to track and to hold kids accountable, there are a lot of systemic things that are just embedded in how public schools work, how education system works, how capitalism works, that makes it easy, I think, to treat people without compassion, without humanity. And for places like New Bedford, perhaps that change feels like it's taking a long time, but even from the 7 years that I've been here, I have noticed a lot of change. For instance, the work that we're doing around becoming an anti-racist school, the fact that one of our main PDs this year was to really unpack the legacy of slavery, to unpack the legacy of systemic discrimination and racism in our country was such a big thing that if you told 2 years ago, Mr. Nagayoshi, that this is the kind of training that New Bedford High School is going to be doing, I would have been very surprised, right? I think a lot of it has to do with the shift in culture. I also think a lot of it has to do with folks who are stakeholders, like alumni, like students, especially young people, are pushing the leaders, are pushing us educators, are pushing the school administrators that there is a problem and letting it be known. And so I'm really a firm believer that spaces like this, the conversation, the inspiration, the perspectives that we share as a result of this are going to hold people accountable and to spur that change and to spur that moment. One quick anecdote, and this is not New Bedford's story, but my partner's school story. At his school, a lot of the students got together, former students and current students, and made a list of grievances of all of the problematic, systemically racist, classist, inequitable things that have happened at that school, the microaggressions that existed. And initially, the school leaders there were really reluctant. They just kind of crossed their arms and said, this new generation just wants to complain about everything. They don't know how great that they have it, and we're not going to listen to their demands. But they ended up taking a more co-constructive approach and started to frame those grievances as an opportunity to open up a discussion and say, let us hear what you have to say and figure out what kind of compromise that we can make, because we acknowledge that while we might not agree with everything that you're telling us that we need to change, we do acknowledge that we are not perfect either. And so what happened was they formed a committee. They had these Zoom sessions with students and teachers and administrators and former educators all coming together, talking, sharing, even crying, right, about some of the things that they've witnessed. And were able to make actual changes to the policies that existed in schools. One of the things that they got rid of were dog sniffs and searches that school apparently had when it came to suspicions of kids having drugs, for instance. And so, not that that's like a template necessarily, but I do think when it comes to advocating for systemic change, for advocating for community change, especially in large systems like New Bedford, making sure that we are organizing, kind of like the work that you are doing, Hunter, Noah, and then the New Bedford alum for Black Lives Matter. I think that's the kind of work that really leads to change, and it gives me hope.
Yes, thank you for providing that. I think that's something that we really need to keep in mind is understanding this idea of exceptionalism isn't necessary for New Bedford. We have, unfortunately, we have our own name to say. Malcolm Garcia, that's a name that New Bedford will know and has spoken about many times. So that's just one of many cases that we have. But understanding that it happens within the classroom and the teacher's role, and that teacher-student relationship is imperative during the school day. But Cynthia, I see that you have a question, and I'm sorry that we've taken so long to get to it. If you want to go ahead and ask.
Sure, don't worry though. All right, so I have so many thoughts and so many questions, but I will just stick to one. Um, I have this terrible feeling that New Bedford Public Schools is going to say that they need to strengthen the program, that, you know, SROs shouldn't be used for discipline, and they should have never been, you know, filling that role, and they really should just be acting as mentors. And I even feel like, because of all of the dialogues that we've had, all the forums that we've had, that they're going to say, well, they just need to be trained to be counselors and social workers and educators. And so I have this fear that they are going to just say, we're going to strengthen the program, we're going to invest more money into this. And obviously that will be to make you know, white educators that love police in schools feel good. And it really will mean that the experiences of people of color and the research doesn't matter. So how will you all feel if that is the approach that New Bedford Public Schools takes? If that's the direction they go, how are you all going to feel about this?
I, for one, am going to want to see their degrees and their internship experience and their education, and it's going to take a very long time. And if the school department is going to start paying for degrees for these police officers, then I might go get a new one. Why not?
You have a point. Very good.
I can see that coming out of some of this discussion too. Then I think we just have to fight harder, collect more data. There hadn't previously been a lot of data that was available, but it's becoming more prevalent now. And one thing, you can't argue with the numbers. They are what they are. And if they think that they can come up with a way for this to work, I would listen to the ideas, but it's very difficult once a program has started to sink to really be able to revive it. You have to start with a blank slate, and you can put resources into people who already have this training. And I think that we could just try to emphasize that and see what another infrastructure is going to look like. If you've got people with these degrees in these positions that are saying they're being underutilized, maybe conversations can begin to exist between the teachers and the counselors that are already in place.
Yes, and before we give anyone else the time to respond, I do just want to say that we are at that 5:30 mark, and I don't want to police this space because, you know, we're very anti-policing here. So, but we will leave this open for anyone though that needs to leave a call or needs to do anything, whatever. And this is also open to our panelists that may be booked as well. Feel free to hop off. We totally respect and understand your time. But for anyone that does want to continue this conversation, this discussion, and is able to, feel free and things like that. And yeah, so we're just going to leave the space open for a little bit to see if anyone has anything that they want to say or anything like that. And if not, feel free to just hop off or things like that. And thank you all for joining. And hopefully you can look forward to future things that we talk about and do and things like that. Thank you. And again, just leaving the space open.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, my name is Bonnie. I just wanted to make a point as a parent. I just found out this year that about like the segregation that's going on at the high school, because I did just have a student graduate, not last year, but the year prior. This is her second year in college, but I have a new daughter who went, have the same last name. They're both with ethnicity. But yet my white daughter was on the green team and my brown daughter is on the tan. I didn't even know that these even existed, that there was even different teams, like not color and origin, you know, your ethnicity, none of that. So like, I just wanted to point out that I was really shocked to find that out, and to have one family with two different colored kids, you know, basically segregated. And I feel it's because of their skin color, and probably, you know, academic level. It did some play in it, but I don't know. I just wanted to add that in there. Thank you. And I really think this meeting you guys are having is necessary and wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, Bonnie, thank you for that input. As a former alum, along with Noah, we were in a majority of AP classes, and I can speak on my own experiences that the environment or the dynamic in those classes is a completely different world than your other level courses. The way that the teachers engage with the students, the way that the teachers use the SROs as a mechanism to maintain their classroom is completely different between the different levels of classes that I experienced at NBHS. So I think you're completely right in acknowledging that, which unfortunately Mr. Nagayoshi left, and he might have had something to say about this as they've changed over the years. But I think you were speaking of your kids who are in there now, so it's still a problem.
Yes, thank you.
Do we have any other questions or comments that anyone would like to make during this time? Feel free.
Hi guys, it's Cindy again.
Hello.
Hi. So at the beginning, I felt like, and maybe I did not hear you guys correctly, but I felt like I heard Takeru, Hunter, and it might have even been someone else talk about negative experiences between New Bedford Public School students and police. Like you knew of certain incidences where they were handcuffed, arrested, or whatever. But that's not reported. Like if you look at, you know, I think it's the DESE website, New Bedford Public Schools says there are 0 arrests. So if you guys know of incidents and it's not there, then what else isn't being reported? And how, and you know, and are they using that data to say, New Bedford Public Schools is the exception. We have no arrests here. Our police officers don't engage in discipline at all. They're just wonderful mentors. They're just upstanding citizens to guide our troubled youth in the right direction. Like, I mean, they use that data, I'm sure, right? To say that New Bedford Public Schools is the exception. But if you guys know of incidents and they're not reported, it's just, that's so concerning to me. I worked in New Bedford Public Schools years ago. I haven't worked there for a while, so I don't know like first person examples, but it sounds like you guys do.
Yeah, I mean, I personally wasn't handcuffed by a SRO at New Bedford High, but I definitely witnessed students being handcuffed, students being apprehended by SRO officers, not only at New Bedford High, but at Keith Middle School, which is a completely different age category. That transition from elementary to middle school is so big for these students. I mean, I remember in 6th grade, one of the incidences that I remember is a student just being handcuffed aggressively in front of me in 6th grade. That is my memory of Keith Middle School. So that's it is happening. I think that gets to another issue that we're seeing is this lack of transparency between not only the police department and the school, but the school system and the larger community. And this is something that is concerning as they go through this process, is how transparent are they being with the data collection? What data are they collecting? What are they going to actually show to us out of the data that they collect? that's something that we as an organization would like to see full transparency on their behalf in terms of this whole conversation.
And I think as well, just adding on to that, and to get at why they might be able to handcuff students, but then also say that no one's being arrested, it might be because of how they are defining arrested. Like, I'm not going to go into what the legal definition of what arresting means because I don't know exactly. I'm not a law student, so I can't tell you. But most likely, what they're doing is using that gray area within that idea of like arresting, being all like, no, they were handcuffed. They were only taken out of the school lunchroom for talking, things like that, but they were not sent to the whatever. So they weren't sent to like the police station. So they might say, so that's not being arrested, that's being apprehended through the use of handcuffs. So there's that gray area that exists there, in which that like they're able to operate within that zone of, I guess, unknown / gray area of just, legalese, whatever. So I think that's part of it as well. And it also goes into the deeper thing of school resource officers and the role that they play with, I don't like to call them school resource officers. Let me say that first of all, because I think I'm very big on discourse and the way that we think about and conceptualize things. And I think thinking about them as resource officers is very problematic, especially because, that's assuming that they are a resource. But anyway, it just for me, it just relates to the large idea of they're able to just do whatever they want in the school because of the ambiguity of their role. And also, one thing that we were trying to get about this conversation is to recognize the ways that SROs are intentionally harmful by design and things like that. So they will most definitely look for that gray area to function within and criminalize and harm students for the purpose of just doing so. And I think that's important to note. Yes, I don't want to take up too much time. If anyone has any more thoughts or anything like that, and also, like I said earlier, we're just going to keep this space open until the conversation dies down completely. And again, if anyone needs to go or anything like that, feel free. You're more than welcome. It's just an open space. And yeah.
The use of any restraint should be reported. If that's a means of control that they are using or a force, then it should absolutely be reported. There should be full transparency. Another concern I have with the transparency is that propaganda video that was put out in a previous meeting that I attended, where everything was yay, 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 let's go SROs, where Robbie from the Boys and Girls Club was saying how he was informed of what to look for, some trouble that might be going on in the school, so he could try to then moderate the behavior of the kids coming in. What happened in school? Why is that being reported to a nonprofit organization where a child is going later on? That in itself is problematic. But yet there's no transparency to the actual public or the other parents of students in this school. That's problematic to me. Why are SROs being used to inform other community members of problems in the school?
Okay, just doing a quick check-in just to make sure. Does anyone have any thoughts or anything that they would like to add? And I also just want to say 100% agree with Chaplain Burke. Most definitely, everything needs to be reported. Part of the problem is we don't have that data, even though we know that they are intentionally there to cause harm. They're able to present these ideas of the benefit exceptionalism because we don't have the data to be like, hey, so they're able to be like, hey, that's only a national problem. Here in New Bedford, we're great. So most definitely, we need that data as well. That consciously just not giving that to us. But again, sorry, saying so much. But anyway, again, does anyone have anything else that they would like to add? Oh, Cynthia, I see Keegan just raised his hand. Feel free.
On the same line, I think that's an important thing that should be brought up to the Superintendent Anderson and these police officers about the difference between handcuffing and arresting. Because from my experience, especially at Keith, handcuffing was done a lot. Especially in the cafeteria, if people were too loud. I'm thinking back on it, and the optics of it were terrible. It was all white men principals, telling this, cafeteria of kids, of color, quiet down, or we'll bring in police officers to handcuff you. So I think that should be brought up to Superintendent Anderson. Will you do anything? That's my comment.
Yeah, and I think that's another important part of this conversation is making it public, inviting everyone here to this discussion so that we can hold the school committee accountable for what they are doing. I think that's essential. So not only this conversation that we're having, but I encourage all of you who are here to continue having these conversations, to continue addressing teachers in your schools or that you work in or go to, the school committees, um, about these issues. And this isn't something that you can just say, "Oh, we sent you something weeks ago. Now we're going to forget about it and hope that you do something." This is a continual conversation that we have to acknowledge and have. Um, were there any final questions that anyone had or comments?
Okay, so it seems like we might be getting towards the end, so I'm going to start concluding things. And if someone has something that is exactly just on their mind that they want to say, feel free to stop me in the midst of this. I would just like to say, first of all, say thank you to Hunter. Thank you to also Rehab, Emma and Max with Chico, who are also very important in helping us put this together as well as the rest of our members as well for helping us. I see Leslie, I see Catherine on the call as well. So I want to thank all of our members that helped us put this together, asking questions, attending our meetings, basically doing the groundwork that helped us to have this. Again, as well, we want to thank our featured guest, Chaplain Burke. We want to thank again Mr. Nagayoshi. We want to thank everyone that was involved in having this conversation. I also want to thank all of you for your comments, thanking all of you for your input, and just being willing. And I'm sure some of us may have different thoughts on SROs, and low key, we hope you change them if you don't agree with us. I'm not gonna lie, I'm just being honest here. Y'all probably know how we feel about SROs, give them a name, okay? But yes, so I hope that this was an encouraging discussion and that you felt able to just speak how you felt and also learn something within the process. That was part of our main goal of tonight. And again, thank you all, and feel free to look out for anything that we're doing in the future and look for our different social media websites, share our different posts and statements and things like that. Help us continue these conversations with the community, continue the work that we are doing, and things like that. And yeah, so at that point, feel free to log off or anything like that. If you have any final questions you want to ask Hunter or I at the end after lunch off, if anything that you want to talk about, just feel free to be here for a few more seconds. But besides that, have a great night, everyone. Thank you all for this great discussion. We hope that it was informal for you as well. Informative for you as well. Ooh, not informal. Well, it was informal. Let me stop. Informative. But yes, have a great night.
Noah and Hunter, I have a quick question. Do you know when the date is for the next NBPS SRO forum? Because people at this event might want to go to that.
So they did say at the last school committee meeting that they were going to have the results from the survey posted prior to the next school committee meeting, which I believe is on the 9th, which is this upcoming Monday, if I'm not wrong. However, I looked at the agenda for the next upcoming meeting. It did not mention SROs on the agenda specifically. So I don't know exactly what their timeline is going to be regarding that. That's something that we're also deeply trying to figure out as well, because I'm sure we all know that the process that they are going through is not a process that's actually conducive to the real change that we need, but at the same time, it's important to be informative about what's going on. So we're not too sure. If anyone else on the call has any ideas regarding that, feel free to let us know or anything like that. But sadly, we're not too sure. Is there any other questions for Hunter or I specifically? Again, I don't want to hold people for too long or anything like that. Bryce, I believe you might be speaking, but we can't hear you. At least I can't hear you. I don't know if your audio is on, or your mic, I should say mic. Now you're good, I can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yes. So I'm not Bryce. I'm on my brother's Zoom. I'm the older brother, Brandon. Carolyn is my mother. I just want to say that what you guys are doing is very, very admirable. As alumni of New Bedford High, I'm very, very proud, and I love to see this going on, and you inspired me. So thank you, Noah. Thank you, Hunter. And thank you, everybody that's a part of this great organization. I want to get involved, so I'm want to reach out to somebody. I know multiple people in this Zoom call, so I'm going to be reaching out to see how I can become more involved, because I want to get involved with this. It's a great organization, and you guys are very, very awesome. So just want to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate all of that. And yes, we'll make sure to get our like membership form and things like that out there so that you can get more involved. More would love to have you. The more the merrier. Yes. Actually, I can drop that down now, actually. Thank you, Chaplain, for reminding me. That's how technology works. Absolutely. But yes, if there's no other questions or thoughts or anything, feel free to blast. I'm going to drop this link so that Bryce can have our contact information in the future. Oh, sorry, not Bryce. The name says Bryce. I keep thinking Bryce. But if anyone else doesn't have anything, feel free to drop the call, or feel free to wait for us to drop the link or anything of that nature. Thank you, Bonnie. Have a great night. Thank you for your question, and thank you for sharing your experiences. Thank you. Mhm. I'm gonna find our membership form really quick. Thank you, Keegan, as well. Have a great night. Thank you, Chaplain Burke. It's an honor to have you. Very informative responses. We learned a lot.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful, blessed evening.
You as well. Okay. Dropping the link now to our membership form for anyone may be interested in attending. Yep, so just drop the link for anyone who might be interested. It's left on the call. Oh wait, it's just 4 of us. That's so funny. I'm over here speaking. That's iconic. Great. So I'm going to stop recording now. Why was I still recording, Jesus?
All right, I'll